Ex-husband confronted the ex-wife at the opera balcony until a hidden patron overturned his plans. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters. John had always been a man of action, a man who never shied away from confrontation. He had spent the last few years moving through life, sometimes aimlessly, always feeling like something was missing. And now, as he stood in front of the Grand Opera House, that feeling surged within him once again. He had a plan. A plan that, for the first time in years, gave him purpose. The woman he once called his wife, Emily, was seated just across the room, elegantly dressed, poised like the lady she always had been. John hadn't seen her in months, but tonight, the distance between them felt like years. There was unfinished business between them, and John was determined to address it, to confront her, to finally say what had been left unsaid for far too long. His eyes scanned the room, briefly catching the gaze of some familiar faces, but his focus never wavered from Emily. He could see her delicate figure sitting in the balcony, her posture perfect, her eyes fixated on the stage. Her hair, a soft wave of auburn, shimmered under the dim lights. But it wasn't the beauty of the evening or the magnificence of the opera that consumed him, it was her. He hadn't prepared himself for this moment. He didn't know how this confrontation would go, but he didn't care. It had to happen. It was time to settle the score. As he made his way towards the balcony, he felt a rush of adrenaline flood through his veins. The closer he got, the more his heartbeat quickened. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something else, anticipation perhaps. Maybe even the thrill of finally taking control of a situation that had haunted him for years. As he reached the balcony's edge, his presence didn't go unnoticed. Emily turned, her gaze meeting his for the first time since their separation. The moment was electric, charged with years of unresolved tension. She didn't look angry, nor did she seem surprised. Instead, there was a calmness in her eyes, a certain quiet understanding. She had always been good at hiding her emotions, but John could read her better than anyone else. He could see the slight tremble in her fingers, the subtle tightening of her jaw. There was still a part of her that felt the weight of their past, even if she wasn't willing to show it. "Emily," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge to it. "We need to talk." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked away, her gaze drifting toward the stage. It was as if she was trying to decide whether to engage or to turn her back on him once more. But John wasn't going to let her do that. He stepped closer, making sure she couldn't ignore him. This time, there would be no avoiding the confrontation. There would be no running away. Emily was about to find out that John was done waiting. John stood there, waiting for Emily to acknowledge him, the tension between them hanging in the air like a thick fog. The sound of the opera orchestra played faintly in the background, but it felt distant, irrelevant to the moment unfolding between the two of them. Emily's eyes remained fixed on the stage, but John knew she was aware of him, could feel the weight of his gaze on her. He had always been able to read her, and now, it was no different. It was as if she was trying to pretend he wasn't there, that this wasn't happening. But John wasn't going to let her avoid it. Not this time. He cleared his throat, trying to get her attention once more. "Emily," he said, his voice a little firmer this time. "I know you hear me. We need to talk. Now." Emily finally turned her head, her eyes meeting his once more, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something there. It wasn't anger, nor was it indifference. It was a mixture of regret, and something else he couldn't quite place, something deeper. Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but then she hesitated, looking down at her hands, nervously clutching the fabric of her dress. John could see the unease in her, the way she tried to steady herself. She wasn't ready for this, he realized. She wasn't prepared for the confrontation that was long overdue. But John had been ready for years. "I don't want to do this here, John," she said quietly, her voice soft, almost resigned. "This isn't the place. Not like this." John felt a flicker of frustration. He had been patient for so long, and now, just when he was finally ready to face her, she wanted to walk away. But he wasn't going to let her. Not this time. "Where else, Emily? Where else are we supposed to do this? You've had years to avoid it. We're here now, and we're going to face it." The silence between them grew thick, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of the opera seemed to fade even more as the world around them narrowed to just the two of them standing there, locked in an unspoken battle. Emily closed her eyes, taking a slow breath before she spoke again. "I didn't want it to end like this, you know. I didn't want any of this to happen." Her voice trembled slightly, and John could see the vulnerability beneath her calm exterior. It was the first crack in her armor, and it hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, he almost felt the walls between them beginning to crumble. But he quickly shook it off. He wasn't here for this. He wasn't here for apologies or pity. "It doesn't matter what you wanted, Emily," John said, his voice cold but controlled. "What matters is what happened. What we both did. And we need to talk about it. We need to face it." Emily looked at him again, and this time, there was something different in her eyes. She was no longer looking at him with the detachment of someone who had long moved on. She was looking at him as if, for a brief moment, she was seeing him as the man she once loved. But that moment didn't last long. "I'm not ready for this," she said again, her voice shaking just a little. "I can't do this now." John's patience was wearing thin. He had waited long enough, and he wasn't about to let her back out now. "You don't get to decide when, Emily," he said firmly, stepping closer. "We've both been avoiding this for too long, but not anymore. Not today." Just as the words left his mouth, a figure in the shadows caught his attention. A man, standing just behind Emily, had been quietly observing their conversation. At first, John thought it was just someone passing by, but the way the man lingered, his presence seeming to grow more significant by the second, made John pause. Who was this person? And why had he been watching them so intently? The figure behind Emily stepped forward, his presence shifting the dynamic between her and John. At first, John had written him off as just another theatergoer, perhaps someone who had been lingering near the balcony, distracted by the performance. But now, as the man moved into clearer view, it was impossible to ignore him. There was something intentional about his stance, something that suggested he wasn't just a passerby. John's eyes narrowed as he sized him up. The man was tall, well-dressed, wearing a dark suit that blended seamlessly with the sophisticated ambience of the opera house. But it wasn't his attire that caught John's attention, it was the way the man was watching them. Not in a casual way, but with a sharp, focused intensity that made John uneasy. "Who's this?" John asked, his voice firm, but with an edge of curiosity. Emily glanced at the man before turning back to John, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. It's nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just a friend. Someone I met recently." John didn't believe her. He could see it in the way she avoided his gaze, the tightness in her voice. There was something more to this encounter than Emily was letting on. He couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger had been watching them for longer than he realized. "A friend?" John repeated, his brow furrowing. "Is that what you're calling him now?" Emily's jaw tightened at the challenge in his tone, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked at the man, silently giving him a subtle nod. The man, still standing behind her, stepped forward again, his eyes shifting to John with a calm, almost calculating gaze. "I think it's time for you to leave," the man said, his voice smooth but authoritative, not quite a suggestion, more of an order. The words sent a jolt through John, but he held his ground. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low but filled with disbelief. "Who the hell are you to tell me to leave?" The man didn't flinch. He simply stood there, unbothered by John's challenge, his presence remaining as steady as a rock. "I'm someone who doesn't appreciate people making scenes in public," the man replied, his tone never wavering. "And I don't think this is the right place for this conversation." John felt his temper flare, but he managed to restrain it. This wasn't about fighting with some stranger who had no idea what was going on between him and Emily. No, this was about getting the truth. And John wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. "I don't care where we are," John shot back, his voice hardening. "I've waited too long for this. We're having this conversation, and I'm not leaving until we do." Emily, caught between them, shifted uncomfortably. She didn't speak, but John could see the conflict in her eyes. The man, however, wasn't backing down. "Then you're making a mistake," he said quietly. "This doesn't have to go any further." John didn't know who this man was, but he had a feeling that whatever his connection to Emily was, it was important. Important enough for him to interfere in a confrontation that was none of his business. "I don't think you understand," John said, stepping closer to the man, not backing down either. "This is between me and Emily. Nobody else." The man looked at him for a moment, sizing him up, before giving a small nod. "I understand," he said, his voice cold and final. "But you don't get to dictate when and where this happens. Emily doesn't owe you anything. Not anymore." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He wasn't prepared for that. "What the hell do you mean by that?" John demanded, his voice rising, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he just stood there, unwavering, as if he had all the time in the world. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, neither John nor Emily spoke. But then, the man's next words, though quiet, were enough to shake John to his core. "Let it go, John. It's over." John stood there, stunned by the man's words. "Let it go, John. It's over." The words echoed in his mind, but they didn't make sense. How could it be over? How could everything between him and Emily, everything they had fought for, just end like this? His mind raced as he tried to process what had just been said. He wasn't ready to walk away. He couldn't. Not without answers, not without closure. "Over?" John repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flickered to Emily, who stood in silence, her face unreadable. The man's gaze followed John's, but he didn't say anything more. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Emily shifted, her fingers tightening around the railing in front of her. She seemed torn, caught between John and this stranger. "Emily," John said, his voice cracking just a little as he turned back to her. "Please, just tell me the truth. Is this really it? Is this how it ends?" Emily didn't respond immediately. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her lips pressed together in a tight line. It was clear she wasn't going to make this easy for him. John could feel the anger welling up inside of him, but he held it back. This wasn't the time for rage. Not yet. He had to know. He had to understand why she was so distant, why she had turned away from him. "I never wanted it to end like this," Emily finally said, her voice soft and hesitant. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. "But it did, John. It happened. And we both have to live with it." "Live with it?" John repeated, his heart sinking. "You've moved on, haven't you? Is that what this is about? Is that why you're so cold?" There was a brief flicker of something in Emily's eyes, guilt, regret, something that made John pause. But she quickly hid it, as if it was too painful to face. "I'm not cold," she said quietly. I don't know how to fix this. We've both made choices, and now, we have to deal with them." John wanted to scream, wanted to demand that she explain every decision, every moment that had led them to this point. But the man standing beside her spoke again, cutting through his thoughts. "You should leave, John," the man said calmly. "This is not the place for this conversation. You've had your time, and now it's over." The words felt like a slap in the face. John's fist clenched, his jaw tightening, but he didn't move. Instead, He looked at Emily one last time, hoping for something, anything that might tell him he was wrong, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. But all he saw was the same unreadable look, the same distance that had been growing between them for so long. "You're right," John said, his voice low, almost to himself. "It's over. I can see that now." With one final glance at Emily, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the opera house, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he left the balcony behind, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had come here for answers, for closure, but what he had found instead was emptiness. And as he disappeared into the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had stood with Emily, the man who had told him to leave, was somehow part of the reason why it had all fallen apart. John walked through the crowded halls of the opera house, his footsteps quick and purposeful, but each step felt heavier than the last. His mind raced, processing everything that had just happened. The conversation with Emily, the stranger who had intervened, and the crushing realization that everything he had hoped for, closure, reconciliation, had slipped through his fingers. He wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice of it all. But as he stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of the moment hit him all at once. He stopped, standing at the edge of the street, his eyes scanning the darkened city around him. The opera house, so grand and full of life just moments ago, now seemed like a distant memory. Everything felt surreal, like he was standing in someone else's life, not his own. What was he supposed to do now? Emily had moved on, and that much was clear. She had someone else, someone who, according to her, had been there for her in ways John never had. He couldn't deny it. The stranger's calm, authoritative presence had unsettled him. There was a quiet confidence in that man, a confidence that seemed to push John aside like he was nothing. But who was this man? What role did he play in Emily's life? John didn't have the answers, and it frustrated him. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to understand their motivations. But with Emily, it was different. It had always been different. Emily was a puzzle he could never solve, no matter how hard he tried. And now, as he stood there, feeling the cold breeze brush past him, he realized that maybe he was never meant to solve it. Maybe some things were simply beyond his control. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn around. He tensed, but it was just a couple walking hand in hand, laughing as they passed by. He watched them for a moment, wondering what it would have been like if things had turned out differently. What if he and Emily had worked through their issues? What if they had been able to rebuild their relationship? But those were just dreams, weren't they? He could never go back. John's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message. It was from Emily. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating for a moment. What could she possibly have to say now? He didn't want to read it, didn't want to face whatever words she had typed out, but he knew he had no choice. With a deep breath, he opened the message. "John, I know this was difficult. I never wanted to hurt you. But it's too late for us. Please understand that I've moved on, and I need you to do the same." The words stung, more than he expected. But there was nothing in them that surprised him. He had known this was coming. Still, seeing it in writing made it feel more final, more real. It was over. Just like the man had said. He stood there, holding the phone in his hand, staring at the screen for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a resigned sigh, he typed one final reply. "I understand." As he hit send, he felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders, but in its place was a deep emptiness. He had no more answers, no more hopes. It was over. And for the first time, John finally accepted it. I walked down the empty streets, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The cool evening air cut through my jacket, but it did little to shake off the feeling of emptiness that had settled in my chest. The message from Emily still lingered in my mind. It was over. Just like that. The weight of the words, so simple yet final, had crushed me in a way I hadn't expected. I had tried for so long to hold on to something that was already slipping away. I had wanted to believe that there was still hope, that maybe things could be different. But now, with her words in my hands, I had no choice but to face the truth. I couldn't hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. As I walked, I tried to push the thoughts aside, but they kept coming back. What went wrong? How did we end up like this? We had been so in love once. It hadn't always been perfect, but we had made it work. At least I thought we did. Now, all of it felt like a distant memory, something I had dreamed up. I remembered the first time we met. It had been at a mutual friend's party, and I had been struck by her laugh, the way it lit up the room. She was different from anyone I had ever met, smart, funny, confident. I had never believed in love at first sight, but that night, I had come close. And for a while, things had been great. But somewhere along the way, we had lost touch with each other. Life had a way of getting in the way, and before I knew it, we were arguing more than we were laughing. There were things left unsaid, feelings buried deep down that we never dealt with. And now, those things had come to a head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been holding on to the past. I had been so focused on what we used to be that I couldn't see what we had become. We were two people who had changed, grown apart. And maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time for me to let go. As the night grew quieter, I found myself standing in front of the old coffee shop where we had first met. The windows were dark, and the door was locked. It was strange to think that something so familiar could feel so distant. I used to walk in here, expecting to see Emily sitting at our usual table, a book in her hand, her eyes focused on the pages. But tonight, it was just another empty building. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, the memories flooding back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was over, but that didn't mean it had to be the end of everything. It was just the end of one chapter, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to turn the page. With a deep breath, I turned away from the shop and walked down the street, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could move forward. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I was ready to find out. John woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He reached for it, his eyes still heavy from the restless night he had spent wrestling with his thoughts. As he glanced at the screen, he saw a new message notification from Emily. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he hesitated before opening it. After everything that had happened, he didn't know what to expect. With a deep breath, he tapped on the message. John, I've been thinking a lot about everything. I know this is hard, but I hope you understand why things had to end. I need you to be okay, and I hope you find happiness again. The words seemed so simple, but they hit him harder than he had anticipated. She was right. Things had ended, and there was no going back. He had spent so much time focusing on the past that he had never fully embraced the idea of moving forward. He had always hoped for a second chance, a chance to make things right, but now, that hope seemed futile. John let out a long breath as he set the phone down. The weight of her words still lingered, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something shifting inside of him. A quiet realization that perhaps it was time to stop holding on to the past and start living in the present. He stood up from the bed, stretched, and walked over to the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the city. It was a new day, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. He wasn't sure what his future looked like, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to keep dwelling on what could have been. There was a whole world out there, waiting for him to step back into it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living for himself again. He dressed quickly, pulling on his jacket and grabbing his keys. The city was still waking up, the streets quiet, but there was a sense of possibility in the air that he couldn't ignore. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but it didn't scare him anymore. It was just the next chapter, and he was ready to face whatever came his way. As he walked out the door and into the early morning light, John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer the man who had been clinging to a past that wasn't his to hold on to. He was someone new, someone who was finally ready to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He didn't know what the future held, but he was excited to find out. John spent the next few days adjusting to the quiet that had settled into his life. The silence was deafening at first, like a constant reminder of everything that had changed. He had walked away from the past, but walking forward wasn't as simple as it sounded. There were moments when the weight of his emotions would catch up to him, and he'd find himself lost in memories. Emily's face, her voice, the way she used to laugh, those things still haunted him, but less now. Every time he thought about calling her, he would stop himself. He knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but part of him still longed for the connection they once had. It was strange how something so familiar could feel so distant. He knew he needed to keep moving, but there was no map for this journey. His thoughts turned to his friends, to the people who had always been there for him. It had been too long since he had connected with them. Maybe this was the right time to start rebuilding those bonds. That afternoon, he called up Greg, a friend he hadn't seen in months. "Hey man, how've you been?" Greg's voice on the other end of the line was a welcome sound, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything was just as it used to be. They made plans to meet up at the old bar they used to hang out at. It was familiar, comforting even. As John walked into the bar, the familiar hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft background music welcomed him. It felt good to be around people again, to feel like he wasn't alone in this world. Greg was already there, sitting at their usual booth, a smile breaking across his face as he saw John walk in. "Well, look who finally decided to join the land of the living," Greg teased, standing up to give him a hug. "You've been MIA, man. How's everything going?" John shrugged, trying to downplay it. "You know, getting by. Things have been different, but I'm managing." The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with Greg. It was like no time had passed at all. They talked about work, life, and the things that didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things but felt important in the moment. As they talked, John realized that he was enjoying himself. He was actually laughing, something he hadn't done in a while. Greg's jokes, the camaraderie, it all felt like a small step toward moving forward. He didn't know if he was ready to dive back into life full force, but at least he wasn't standing still anymore. By the end of the night, John felt lighter, as if a small part of the burden he'd been carrying had been lifted. It was a reminder that even in the toughest times, there was always something to hold on to, something that could pull him through. As he left the bar, he took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying the world on his shoulders. He still had a long way to go, but that night, he felt a little bit more like himself again. John had started to find comfort in his routine again. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days blended together, some better than others, but slowly, the weight of the past was becoming more manageable. He had started exercising again, something he had let slide during the darker days, and each morning jog helped clear his mind. There was something soothing about the rhythm of his steps, the cool morning air, and the steady beat of his heart. It gave him a sense of control, of purpose. As the weeks went by, John's life began to take on a new shape. He had reconnected with old friends, like Greg, and started focusing on things that made him happy. He had rediscovered his love for reading, something he had always enjoyed but had abandoned during the chaos of the past year. Little by little, he was rebuilding himself. One evening, as he sat at home reading a book, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his mom. "I hope you're doing well, son. It's been a while. We miss you." The words felt like a warm embrace. He hadn't realized how much he missed his family until that moment. In the rush of everything, he had pushed them away, thinking that being alone was the only way forward. But now, he knew better. He couldn't do it alone. He needed the support, the connection, and the love that only family could give. He called his mom right away. "Hey Mom," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "I miss you too. I've been meaning to call." They talked for a while, catching up on life, talking about everything and nothing. It felt good, grounding. When the conversation ended, John sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle in. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't the absence of problems, but the acceptance of them. He had learned to stop fighting against his past, to stop trying to force things to go the way he wanted them to. Life was unpredictable, and that was okay. He didn't need all the answers right now. As he closed the book on his lap, he realized that he was finally moving forward. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he was going somewhere. And that was enough for now. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He had a future to look forward to, and for the first time in a long time, that future felt bright. John stood up from his chair, stretched his arms above his head, and walked over to the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. He smiled, feeling the first true sense of hope in a long time. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He was ready to live again,